Hi everyone, Arl here. Just to give you a quick kind of background on myself, I was with Brandon as a student the very first time that he taught this course, and I chose to sign up for the LGBT module. It was also on my suggestion that we ended up reading Fun Home. Me and my friend, who were in a group together, his name was Jacob Frady, you can see it there, made this presentation on Fun Home and LGBT representation and sort of a history. And Brandon urged me that I should kind of give a condensed version of my lecture during this course so that you can just kind of see what I made and how I kind of wanted the Fun Home lecture to go and what I thought was important to talk about. So, without further ado, let's start. I think the first thing that's important that we need to talk about is Alison Bechdel herself, right? So she's the author of Fun Home. Fun Home actually has a sequel book if you end up liking it. It's called Are You My Mother? It's about her relationship with her mom. And she's also the creator of the long running comic series Dykes to Watch Out For. She started creating comics in 1985. If the name Alison Bechdel sounds familiar to you, it's actually because she created a test that's known as the Bechdel test. Maybe you've heard of this before when talking about movies or television shows or something. So the Bechdel test states that the medium, i.e. a movie for example, has to have at least two named women in it who, two, talk to each other about something that is three, not a man. So as long as there are two women that are characters that have names that are talking about something that is unrelated to a man or a male character of any kind, then that movie passes the Bechdel test. And you would be surprised, you can look it up online, there are websites that chart this, how many movies nowadays do not pass the Bechdel test. For example, most Marvel superhero movies do not pass the Bechdel test because of a lack of female characters and interaction between female characters when they are there. So, here's just a brief thing. You can pause the video if you want to look at it. This is how the Bechdel test came to be. This is from her 1986 comics that she made. Fun Home has three themes kind of wrapped inside of it, some more noticeable than others. One is that of your sexuality, and more so aligned with your hidden sexuality when looking at Bruce Bechdel and his pains in life. The second one is obviously that of death, which is a huge part of the book, and I think that everybody sort of saw that when reading it. And the third one is kind of unraveling this concept of what your gender identity is. So I thought I'd take just a couple looks at these themes that are present in Fun Home so we can sort of break them down piece by piece. So on hidden sexuality, one of the quotes that really stuck out to me that Bechdel writes is, "I suppose that a lifetime spent hiding one's erotic truth could have a cumulative renunciatory effect. Sexual shame is in of itself a kind of death." So what Bechdel is basically saying here is that she feels in many ways that her dad was already dead when he was being alive because he wasn't able to be himself. She expresses this through talking about the house that Bruce Bechdel was so fixated on, this sort of antique Victorian house that they lived in. He was hiding himself through all these mirrors and doorways and interior design choices, basically getting lost in this complex maze of stuff, which is basically how he felt inside of himself. The other thing about hidden sexuality is how it can sort of lead to these problems in life when you're not able to express yourself, how it leads to this mental health crisis. And here, Alison talks about how at 10 years old, she developed obsessive compulsive disorder because she wasn't really able to be herself, so she had to be hidden within herself. And so she had this thing with odd numbers and doorways. We also see this towards the end of the book in the final chapter. If you ask me, this is actually my favorite scene throughout the book, where she's having this kind of awkward conversation with her dad where they're both trying to talk about their sexuality, and it's just such an awkward experience for both of them. This is actually, when you look at the page that I put up about the Broadway version of Fun Home, the song Telephone Wire, which is my favorite song in the musical, is about this moment, and I just think it's very powerful. The second concept, we're talking about death here. There's, Bechdel writes, "Grief takes many forms, including the absence of grief. Maybe you thought it was weird that when Alison found out that her dad died, she didn't actually cry. She called up her brother and they both laughed about it, which is such a strange thing." And Alison had this weird relationship to death growing up because, her family owned the funeral home, so she saw a lot of dead bodies. She had this kind of obsession with Wednesday Addams and the Addams family because she thought that they were so similar because of the house and their kind of morbid personality that a lot of them had. She didn't actually know whether her dad killed himself or whether it was really an accidental death. And towards the end, she kind of was taking comfort in the fact that maybe his death was her fault, and she was reluctant to let that go because she didn't have a lot of bonding opportunities with her dad, and so she kind of cherished the idea of maybe something so big in his life, his death, could be attributed to her, which is such a strange notion to think about. And the last one, which is really big, is gender identity. I kind of blocked off the quote with my face. I'm sorry, I'll read it to you. Bechtel writes, "Then there were those famous wings. Was Daedalus really stricken with grief when Icarus fell into the sea, or just disappointed by the design failure?" This is obviously talking about Bruce figuring out that his daughter is come out as a lesbian. She didn't really understand whether he was upset that he came out as a lesbian, or whether he was disappointed in himself that she was going to have to experience this kind of repressed sexuality that he had to his whole life, a very complex topic. And they were this inversions of each other, right? Bechtel writes that she was trying to compensate for the unmanliness that was present in him, but he was also attempting to express the femininity that he wanted to express through her, and it led to this really rough relationship between the two of them. You see later on that Allison was once mistaken for a boy, and she kind of, in a spur of the moment, was like, oh, yes, this is what I want. This is what I really want in my life. And it was a weird moment for her growing up. You also see this in the diner scene, which is when you look at the Broadway adaptation of Fun Home, you'll see the exact same thing in the song Ring of Keys. It's about this moment, which is a great moment, which is Allison realizing that there are women across the country that look like how she wants to be feeling, and that it's possible to be like this. It's something that she says sustained her through the years. And now, I think it's important to talk about historical instances of LGBT discrimination. And the really big one, the sort of literal catalyst for the gay rights movement. Oh my God, these ears are killing me. This is like really tight. I have a huge head, sorry. I'm not taking it off, is the Stonewall riots. So the Stonewall riots happened on June 28th, 1969, when the New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn, which is a historic gay club in Greenwich Village. Here's a little backstory. Gay bars were not allowed in the 1960s. It was basically considered a crime. Homosexuality was still kind of criminalized at that time. There was still there still is a big stigma about the LGBT community, but there was a really big one back in the 60s. And so gay bars were these kinds of hidden havens where LGBT members could feel at home and feel like themselves. But you might be asking, how do you make a gay bar when there's such a big stigma and crime around it? Well, that is where, and I'm not joking, the Italian mafia came in. The Italian mafia saw that there was big money to be made in gay bars. So what they would do is they would purchase these locations, and typically they were not high quality. I mean, we're talking real like hole in the wall, what you see is what you get. And they would say, listen, this is a place for gays only. They would pay off the police department to not come in and raid it, and the gays and other members of the LGBT community could come in and socialize with each other and mingle and have a good time and feel like themselves. On June 28th, 1969, the police raided the village or Greenwich Village. They raided the location in Greenwich Village. And it was very uncalled for. Nobody knew that it was going to happen. And it wasn't just the raiding of the gay bar that sparked this riot. It was what happened during it. So, for example, they took transgender people into the bathrooms and gave them mandatory sex checks to figure out which gendered paddy wagon they should throw them into. They beat a lesbian with a baton on the head while loading her into a paddy wagon because she wouldn't get in. And more importantly, when this sort of riot started because of how they were treating these LGBT folks, the police got scared and they barricaded themselves in the bar, and they took some of the LGBT patrons as prisoners with them. This led to a riot and a protest that lasted 6 days and had just many violent sparks and clashes with law enforcement outside of the bar and in the area. And it was actually this particular movement, if you've ever heard of the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, HRC, Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, these organizations all started from this one event, from the Stonewall riots. In 2016, the Stonewall Inn was named a national monument for LGBT rights by former President Barack Obama. Another big thing that I feel the need to talk about is the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. And what's really interesting is that there's a lot of parallels between the AIDS epidemic and the coronavirus that we're seeing right now as we're all learning from home. So discrimination towards the LGBT community, specifically homosexual men, reached its peak in 1986. You had the sort of Live Aid concert there that was sort of raising money for them. There came this stigma where gay men were the problem, not the disease itself. And so a lot of gay men were being banned and singled out and abused because they were just considered to be carriers of AIDS. They were nothing more than that. They were just people that had AIDS. And you'll actually see that this is still a part of our government nowadays, albeit there's some regret towards it. But if you look at the Department of Health, right, our Department of Health, MSM stands for men having sex with men, and people that that consider themselves homosexual, men who have sex with men, cannot donate blood still. It's still a rule. It's still a law written into the thing. You have to prove that you have not had sex with a man for 12 months in order to donate blood. So these are just some of the ways that these discriminatory actions from the 1980s still impact us and haunt us today, right? People were calling AIDS the gay plague. They weren't calling it AIDS. They were calling it, the gay disease and things like that, just because it had this sort of effect. And when I was talking about coronavirus, we see this thing where we're calling it the Chinese virus, which is leading to discrimination of Asian Americans of all kinds in our country, when we could just be calling it COVID-19 or coronavirus, its scientific name, right? So this may seem like a long time ago, and I know that there's a wide variety of age ranges in this class, so maybe it might not seem like a long time ago, or maybe it will seem like a long time ago, but I thought I'd give a personal example to kind of make this more touching and personal for everybody. So this is a photo of my mom at 15 years old during her quinceañera, and this is my mom's best friend, Adolfo. My mom chose Adolfo to be with her on her, quinceañera court, because Adolfo was openly gay and my mom was not, she was like, ew, boys, you know how it is. I'm not gonna say it, you know how it is. Anyway, so my mom was with Adolfo during her quinceañera. They danced together and they did the whole thing, and it was very mutually great for both of them, Adolfo, later on in his life, would get diagnosed with AIDS. He would be one of the gay men that contracted HIV. And my mom was one of two people who would go and visit him on his deathbed in the hospital. It was him and it was his grandmother who went to visit him. My mom has told me this story several times throughout my life, just when talking about the issues of gay rights and things. His friends would not come because they were scared that they were going to get AIDS. His parents would not come because they were scared that they were going to get AIDS. Nobody in his life except my mom and his abuelita would visit him, and so he basically died without anybody, because there was this huge fear, this stigma that just being in contact with a gay man could give you HIV, could give you AIDS, right? And this is just, it's awful. It's horrible. And this is my mom that I'm talking about. We're looking at one generation back towards this sort of discrimination. So how does this change? How do we get rid of these stigmas and these discriminatory actions against the LGBT community? Well, for one, there's a lot of historical names that we should be looking at. And this is why I wanted you guys to do this activity that you're going to be doing for this module, because I think it's a really cool activity to do some research about characters and historical figures and personal people in your lives that are impacting the LGBT community. So I'm not going to talk about Harvey Milk because I wrote about Harvey Milk for the activity. So if you really want to know about Harvey Milk, you can read what I wrote for my example activity for the module. Barbara Giddings, she's famous because she fought from the 1970s up until 2006 to have homosexuality removed from the list of psychiatric disorders by the APA. APA is, of course, the American Psychiatric Association, which is sometimes how you guys write papers for classes. So yeah, she fought from the 1970s up till 2006. She was basically primarily attributed to the APA's removal because of how much she fought for it. Magnus Hirschfeld, who my camera is blocking, which is very impolite. I literally blocked his face off like he's the neighbor from Home Improvement or something. Anyway, Magnus Hirschfeld coined the term transvestitism. He established the world's first gender identity clinic, in the early 1900s. If you watched The Danish Girl, that's about Einar Wegner, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who transitions to become Lily Elbe, who's one of the first people to ever successfully undergo gender reassignment surgery. Hirschfeld was the person that was running that clinic. He's a character in that movie, which is so good. Eddie Redmayne is so good, y'all. Anyway, Hirschfeld was openly gay, had a gay rights library where he published all these works and supported gay authors and things like that. He was so influential that in the 1940s in Germany, Hitler described him as the most dangerous Jew in Germany because of how much he was promoting this tolerance of homosexuality and LGBT rights in his country, which is kind of cool if you think about it. We have to think about recent cases too. So, in 2015, we had Obergefell versus Hodges, which was a landmark civil rights case where the Supreme Court ruled that it is the fundamental right of people to marry who they want, that there's guaranteed same-sex marriage. This was only 5 years ago. This was in 2015. So it's really not that long ago, if you're thinking about it. And there's still modern-day discrimination that comes with it. These are these two things. We have Kim Davis, who I believe was a Kentucky. She was a Kentucky marriage license person. It could be Alabama, but I think it's Kentucky. I'm sorry, but she refused to hand out same-sex marriage licenses, even though she worked for the government, and she continued to defy the court orders, and then she was jailed for contempt of court because it's a crime at this point. On the right, that's the man in Colorado. You may have heard of the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission in 2018, where this man would not make a wedding cake for a gay couple, and he claimed that he had religious beliefs. He incited his First Amendment, where he had freedom of religion, to deny it, and that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that he had religious grounds to deny these people because of their sexual orientation. So I'm not saying this is inherently a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not trying to, talk about federal laws with you and cases and things like that. But I'm just saying that we still see a lot of discrimination to this day. That was 2018. That was 2 years ago. So if you're thinking, I really liked Fun Home, I'd like to get into more LGBT comics, well, I can help you out with that. Here's a bunch of comics that are really good. On the left here, we have Batwoman, which is Kate Kane Batwoman. She's openly a lesbian. They talk about it. She was dishonored from West Point Academy because of the, don't ask, don't tell. That's what the whole plot line of Volume 1 is about. If you don't like reading and you like to watch things, Batwoman is actually a show on the CW right now, starring Ruby Rose. The second person that we see, that's Bobby Drake. He's the Iceman. He has a whole arc where Jean Grey goes back in time to tell him hey, you're a closeted gay person and you should be more open about it. It's kind of a weird arc, but it's cool, and Bobby Drake's openly gay now. Currently, there's this whole Archie reboot. I think it kind of deals with the TV shows, if you watch those, that are also on the CW, as I'm realizing. Jughead Jones is currently one of the only asexual characters in any forms of media right now. I think somebody did a poll and there were a total of 3 asexual characters in mainstream comic, television, movies. So it's just huge representation. Love is Love was written in 2016 after the Pulse nightclub shooting. It's a collaboration by a bunch of comic writers and artists and publishers, and all the proceeds from the comic went towards the Victims Fund, which was just incredible. The last one that I'm blocking off, you can't see the name, but that's Lumberjanes, which has 2 characters, Joe, who is trans, and Barney, who is non-binary. And I wish that every book could be as cool as Lumberjanes in passing off how nonchalant these characters are coming out. So it's oh, you're trans? Okay, cool. I just like that it's not a big deal about anything. This concludes my lecture. I'm Arl. I'm the course assistant. If you don't know me, if you haven't seen me yet, feel free to reach out to me, talk to me about things. I really don't mind. I hope you enjoyed this module. I made it myself. I made it with my little heart, my little soul, my little hands, my big computer. Have a great week. Have a great semester. Please wash your hands. Avoid social gatherings if you can help it. Be kind to people. Don't be racist. Don't be discriminatory. Be you. Be yourself. Be unique. Be creative. And just live life. Make the best of what you can. Thank you.